Hey,
Okay, I want to just mention that this learning should be in memory. A friend who is related to one of the tragic death of one of the girls who was killed in Switzerland last week. But that tragedy, I mean, there was also, yes, the tragedy in Yerushalayim. There's, unfortunately, oh, 2 days ago, right? The boy was. So this is Leilui Nishmat Charlotte Rivka Bat Marie Sophie Miriam Zichronala Bracha. She's a 15-year-old girl who died tragically in the fire in Krenz, Montana, Switzerland. And she's related to a friend of mine from Granada, so I just want our learning should be in her memory. Um, and we should only have good news.
right.
Okay, so last week, just to have very quick recap, last week we began Sefer Shmot, and the beginning, it's fascinating to see the transition between the beginning, first of all, the end of Breshit, which we talked about, where we have just one family, Yaakov's family, going down to Egypt, and seems to be a temporary situation. And then we pick up Sefer Shmot, and we go from being a family of 70 souls to what seems to be a nation. And that happens very quickly. That happens in one generation. And so obviously there's something on the one hand, very question that the commentaries question how that's possible. And at the same time, see the miraculous hand of God in this. Um, the other thing that we noted a few things about this, which we're going to explore further today, which is that, first of all, this is the first time that the people of Israel are called a nation. And ironically, they're called a nation by none other than Paro, right? And so Paro says, Hine am b'nei Yisrael. It's the first time they're called that, and they're being called that by this tyrannical, oppressive dictator Paro. And of course, this puts a highlight on the big question, which I think is unbelievably relevant today, which is what defines us as Jewish people, right? How much are we defined in our Jewish identity by an outside, by an oppressor, by anti-Semitism, and how much are we defined as Hina'am B'nai Israel by our own pride and knowledge and embracing of our Jewish identity? And of course, this brings up what podcasters and writers talk about as the October 6th Jews and the October 8th Jews. And so that's something very relevant for our world. The second thing, which was particularly notable, is that we see in the beginning an emphasis, a repeat of the names of Yaakov's children. This was all just listed in the end of Breshit. And here again, we hear the Eilesh Shmot Bnei Israel. These are the names of the children of Israel who went down to Mitzrayim. And then we list them, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, etc., etc., etc. Okay. And so we hear their names again. And of course, the book is called, we call it in English, the book of Exodus, but in Hebrew, we call it the book of names. And so names seem to play a very significant role in this beginning of Sefer Shmot, and we're going to also continue to see that today. Now, one aspect that we explored some sources on this idea, and we're going to continue to explore. But one thing which we didn't really talk about so much, which I want to point out now, is the fact that not only is it Paro who calls us Am B'nai Israel, but more than that, here we have an interesting situation where is the Jewish people born? Now, in our world today, if you hear, one of the things we are accused of is that this land's not really our homeland, right? It's no more our homeland than other people than the Palestinians' homeland, right? And then you have, people who are saying, of course, we are the indigenous people who originated in this land. But when did we originate? Where did we originate as a people? Torah tells us we originated as a people in Egypt. So we have this interesting challenge here because this is something that we talk about in the world. So how prepared are we to talk about this honestly? And of course, famously, you might know that Ben Gurion in the Declaration of the State of Israel says, Hine kam ha'am ha'yehudi. Here in Israel is where the Jewish people became a people. Now, of course, both can be true. can have been started in Egypt and really formed ourselves, our actual nationhood when we finally reached in Tanakh, when we were able to go into Israel and begin as a functioning society in Israel. But that tension is there. And some of our modern scholars will talk about this. So we're just going to take a little journey through. We're going to move from Tanakh for a moment into some modern Zionism, because I think that this really touches on a very powerful chord. And then we're going to go back, of course, to our verses soon. So first of all, we didn't get to source 7 in the first source sheet. Um, I want to introduce you to a fascinating scholar called Leon Kass. I don't know if anyone's heard of him. She quotes it. I know yes, yes. And she actually interviewed him once in her podcast. She was very excited. She sounded like she was very excited. A groupie. Yes, a big groupie. Fascinatingly, he's a man who came from a different field. He's a scientific field of research, and he found himself in love with Bible study at some point, and he started teaching Torah and writing books. And he has a book on Genesis and now a book on Exodus. And he thinks about it in terms of, at least in Exodus, he thinks about it in terms of sort of modern political and sociological perspectives, but he's also very literary. So he has this book called Exodus, Founding God's Nation. And he's very interested in how this book, and he takes it from the very first chapter through the rest of Sefer Shemot, the Exodus, the revelation at Sinai, the building of the Mishkan, et cetera, how these were very foundational parts of the beginning of the nationhood. And we read them because today, where we're so focused on our identity as a nation, we read them and we learn more we're enriched to understand more about how we are God's nation on earth today. So here's what he says in the beginning in source 7. Here he's talking about the beginning of the Jewish people, and in particular, he's very interested in the beginning of a nation. And he says as follows: These descriptions of the multiplication of the children of Israel underscore the crucial question: Are the Israelites at this stage already a people? The answer seems to be no. They are not called a people, or a nation, goy, nor is there any mention of God or their attachment to him. Unlike the barren matriarchs in Genesis, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, the new fruitful generations of Israel apparently did not need or seek divine assistance in order to multiply. To the contrary, the Israelite fecundity seems to partake of the natural and hyper-abundant fertility that is characteristically Egyptian, a gift of the land where the overflowing river guarantees plentiful crops, where the land teems with life, and where even the excrement appears to give birth. The scarab or dung beetle is sacred to the Egyptians, an emblem of immortality because it seemingly springs from the deadliest detritus. And while Israelite fertility takes center stage, the practice of circumcision, the sole covenantal obligation on the children of Israel, is not mentioned. As far as we know, the descendants of Jacob are now a multitude sharing little beyond their common ancestor and their extraordinary fertility. He brings up some very big questions we're going to exploring today. First of all, he points out that the name of God is absent. I think we mentioned this last week. The name of God is absent from chapter 1, and we're only going to meet God again in chapter 2, toward the end of chapter 2. And also he has this incredible depiction of the contrast between Bereshit and Shemot, where Bereshit is a story again and again, one after the other, of the holiest couples in our history struggling to have a child, struggling with fertility. And Sefer Shemot, it seems to come like easy, right? They say bunny rabbits, right, are very right. We have a long history of having bunny rabbits in my family anyway, so I'll tell you about that another time. But they're unbelievably fertile, and it comes easily, and yet they don't need to pray to God. They don't need to be in a place of crisis. And so what's going on here? What's going on with we were told that this family of Jacob and Abraham is going to go down to Egypt and eventually be saved, but what's happening to them in the process? Who are they? Right? We start with Elish Mode, and these are their names, and immediately after, there's a lot of question marks. There's a lot of anonymity. Who are these people? They're only being identified from an outsider enemy, oppressor, Paro. How are they identifying themselves? And they're having all these children, which is, of course, one of the secrets of Jewish survival. And on the other hand, Well, are they even giving these children a Brit Milah, right? Brit Milah is one of the basic expectations, right? Even if you're relatively unaffiliated, that's one of the few things that Jews in the world still do. And so, what's going on with these people? Who are they?
Does it say that in the Midbar they did Brit Milah? Like if they weren't having Brit Milah, so did they do the Midbar? Does there any?
So they do it before, they do it, right, they do it before Har Sinai. They do it before the covenant with God. And then, yes, the assumption is that,
So they hadn't done like that 39 years.
right, absolutely. That seems to be the assumption, that they had not done it. Yes, exactly. Right, 49.
But that one at
49
least
level
gives them,
Tuma, you're saying?
that actually gives, no, I'm sorry, the 39 year in the midbar.
Oh, I
In other
see.
words,
Okay, yeah.
But it actually gives an explanation of why they didn't do it then. Didn't
Right.
give it to any other times. While it was a midbar, it was the danger of travel.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I have my own problem with that one.
Yes,
But,
but also in Egypt, they could have done it in Egypt. And of course, we know we're going to soon see the story of Moshe himself and his children, and Moshe's delaying in giving his children. So even Moshe seems to have delayed in giving his child a circumcision. We're going to look at that story, which is pretty wild. Yeah.
One of the things that seems very clear is that when things are going well and there's fertility and affluence, who needs God?
Yes. I think that's very insightful, right?
Unfortunately, that's
well for them. They were slaves.
no, that's when they started praying. That's when
You should
they
do
started
your-
praying, and that's when it begins. When things are going well, and you see this is Jewish history, when things are going really well.
I agree. Just before they're enslaved, they're multiplying and they seem to be. And then Vayakam Melech Hadash, a new king, right? It does have that feel to it, definitely. So let's look at a few other sources on these issues that we've raised. First of all, Daniel Gordis, who is he writes a lot about Israeli politics and Israeli history, and he lives in Jerusalem and teaches in Shalem College, as does Leanne Cass. He brings up this point, which we highlighted already. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Says Israel's Declaration of Independence, Be'eretz Yisrael kam ha'am ha'yehudi. Right? In this land of Israel, we became a people. So he asks this question. It's an iconic sentence, but is it true? The Bible seems to suggest that it isn't. On numerous occasions, the Torah states that it was not in the land of Israel, but elsewhere that the Israelites became a people. The first person to designate the Israelites a people in Hebrew Am was Paro. Look, the people of the sons of Israel is more numerous and vaster than we. Come, let us be shrewd with them, lest they multiply. A few chapters later, it is God who speaks for the Jews becoming a people. Here too, they are in Egypt. I will take you out from under the burdens of Egypt, and I will rescue you from their bondage, and I will take you to me as a people, and I will be your God, right? So here, even God acknowledges that they are becoming a people first in Egypt. Later, still in the desert, you will become for me a kingdom of priests and a holy people. Encamped in the deserts of Moab on the eastern side of the Jordan River, it is Moshe who speaks. Be still and listen, Israel. This day you have become a people to the Lord your God. None of these are said in the land of Israel. So he really raises this issue. And now we have this interesting tension, because why is it that we wouldn't have become a people first in the land of Israel? So why is it that we had to first be designated people outside of the land of Israel? So as a group, as a table filled with Olim, I want to throw this question out to you. Why do you think the Torah, why do you think God's plan was that we should become people dafka in Galut, dafka in the diaspora?
Because in years to come, we would spend thousands of years in Galut. And he still had to know that in that place, you can still be a people.
Beautiful. I love that. And at the same time, if you hear some more radical rabbi Zionist thinkers today speak, there is this, what we call shlilat hagola, the negation of the diaspora, right? This emphasis on, well, certainly if Israel exists, then everything in the diaspora was secondary, was just bedievit, was what we had to do. But really, there's nothing, now there's no, you see even now, we talked about this last week, people saying, well, there's no reason for anyone to still be living right in New York or New Jersey, right? New York, especially, or Europe now.
Something.
And those of us who come from the diaspora, I think, feel mixed about this. It's uncomfortable. On the one hand, that's where we have a lot of hakarat tov for that world. At the same time, we see the complexity. Not so simple. So, any other reason why?
Well, similar to what Mindy said, they say that the Torah was given on Har Sinai. which is also Chutz La'aretz,
Yes.
was also to show that the Torah can belong Chutz La'aretz.
Okay. Oh, interesting. So I've heard that it's because that no tribe in Israel should say the Torah is mine more than yours, which is interesting. But it's a similar idea that there's almost something, I almost want to say, if anyone's familiar, there's a children's book which has become very popular by Julia Donaldson, this British writer, author, called A Squash and a Squeeze, which is based on a Hasidic story, right? This woman feels her house is too small, and the Hasidic Rebbe says, "Come and bring in your cow," and she says, and then he says, "Bring in your horse and bring in your donkey," and then he says, and she says, "Now it feels even smaller. What did you do, Rabbi?" And he says, "Well, now take them all out." And she says, "Oh, this is amazing. My house feels so big." And so, there's something about perspective and appreciation going on here, right? If we were given Israel on a silver platter, perhaps we would not appreciate it in the same way. And that's definitely a piece of this. So Leon Kass and Nechama Leibowitz actually talk about this question of why it is what it means that the Jewish people were started in the Galut, were started in the diaspora, and why this story happens this way. So Leon Kass in source 9 writes, "The story of how the Israelites become a people begins with their enslavement in Egypt, and we may wonder why such a first step was thought necessary or desirable. The Lord could have chosen other ways to forge Israel's national identity and character. How might reduction to bondage contribute positively and negatively to people formation in general and to this people in particular?" So he's asking a slightly different question, which is, so if they started as a people, not only in Egypt, but enslaved, what does that do for us? And of course, many of you know the answer, because one of the most well-known answers to this is, as we are told throughout the Bible, that we have to carry this memory with us, this memory of being slaves, and it should inform how we interact with the world around us. So he gives a couple of positive reasons. First of all, the people acquire a common enemy against which to define themselves and unite. Sometimes people formation is about being against something rather than being for something. I mean, look at the world right now, Venezuela, Iran, there's like so many examples of this, that identity becoming forged through what I'm not, okay? Being a slave also means that you really have a blank slate in your identity, right? You don't have slaves in halakha and Jewish law really don't have, and they don't have the same amount of obligations as a free person. And so there's something about being a slave, which is like on identity. So here it's a perfect group of people to be infused with identity. The third reason he gives is that they should, coming from their experience of oppression, should shape how they behave when they themselves are in power. Today we talk a lot about being in Israel and having Jewish power. And sometimes that Jewish power, there's a fine line. And we look at some of our government ministers, and sometimes, people struggle with this question of, are they taking Jewish power too far sometimes, right? That was certainly the claims against Mayor Kahana. So something to think about. At the same time, other times we've used it to, I think it was Menachem Begin, who the first act he did was, didn't he help out Vietnamese refugees? I think that was the first thing he did as prime minister. And so there you go, like, Ger Haita, you remember what it is to be Eved Hayitem. So let it inform how you rule. That was a very powerful image. Also, through our low status slaves and our vulnerability, we may be more open to hearing God and believing in God. As they say, there's no atheists in a foxhole, right? So, which we've seen very much. Story after story. It's unbelievable to see how Israel has been transformed. Even if anyone watches, my kids love to watch the TV show Kochav Haba, which is the TV show that chooses who's going to the Eurovision competition. And, to see in the audition, so many people come, and right before they sing, they say like Shema, they like say the Shema. Like, oh my God. Some of them have tzitzit, some of them totally don't. Some of them are wearing tank tops and they're saying the Shema, and it's unbelievable to see. It's a different Israel today than the Israel that I knew 25 years ago, and I'm sure you feel that way too. There are also negative reasons to start out as a slavish people, as Leon Kass likes to call them. First of all, they're slavish. I wrote selfish, I meant slavish. And that means that what we see throughout the book of Shemot and Bamidbar, which is that they're constantly they have no confidence and they're constantly complaining. And in the end, they're not able to cross the border into Israel because they come from a different mentality and they're not able to fully overcome that. Only their children can. And second, they are perhaps open to lawlessness and tyranny because they're not really empowered. So there's negative possibilities as well, but we can see that the positive possibilities of coming from Egypt as slaves set us up for a more successful ability to be a nation and in power than the negative reasons. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'll just mention that in the early if you look at early Zionist literature, I don't know how much you studied this or read about it. The early Zionist thinkers, basically, especially mostly the first few streams of secular Zionism and cultural Zionism, very much it was defined first and foremost. There were other reasons, but first and foremost by anti-Semitism. Right? Herzl became a Zionist and had a dream because the Dreyfus Affair, exactly, right? So we see that they start to write about the fact that we need a nation because we are not going to survive in Galut. So that is why we need a nation. Now, today, if I ask each of you around the table, why do we need Israel? That's of course one reason, but that's not the reason. I think most of us would say, recognize it. It's so much more than that. But that was a huge defining piece for this. Peretz Smolenskin, who was a Zionist writer in Russia, wrote famously, "The Jewish people has outlived all others because it has always regarded itself as a people, a spiritual nation. Yes, we are a people. We have been a people from our beginnings until today. We have never ceased being a people, even after our kingdom was destroyed and we were exiled from our land. And whatever may yet come over us, we will not eradicate our national character." Sorry. So he is basically saying that that we are a people, but we are a people, we are a nation. We need a land. So he doesn't say it as strongly, but we'll see Max Nordau says in source 11, if you skip to the third paragraph, Max Nordau, who also was a Zionist writer from Hungary, and these were all before the establishment of the State of Israel, said, this is a very powerful sentence, "Anti-Semitism has also taught many educated Jews the way back to their people." Okay, but in the case of most Zionists, the effect of anti-Semitism was only to force them to reflect upon their relationship to the nations of the world, and that reflection has led them to conclusions which would endure in their minds and hearts if anti-Semitism were to disappear completely. Okay, so here the argument is anti-Semitism is strong, and we need to get to Israel. Zionist thinking shifts as we start to really grow in the land and become a people. And of course, in the 1980s and the beginning of 2000s, Zionists have to ask themselves, well, now we have the State of Israel. So, and anti-Semitism at that point was looking pretty good. And so why do we need Israel, right? And in fact, I don't know about you, but when I first made Aliyah, I just found that this has definitely gone away over the last 2 years. But early on, any store I'd go into or anyone I'd speak to, and somehow it would come up that I just made Aliyah, they would say, "Why do you live here? Why would you leave America?" Right? And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And it was such a disappointment to hear people say that. Yeah.
But that did not happen in 67.
Yes.
A lot of that was, I remember coming here after 67 in the early 70s. And people would say, "When are you coming? When are you coming?" And the great energy within the country of the strength, the power, the positivity. So I think it waxes and wanes.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Until the
There's
Yom Kippur War.
waxing and waning.
In 67 and 73,
There was very
there was
positive
really
pride.
positive.
Yes.
That's why there was Kochi Otzim Yadzi. People had that haughtiness. And okay, we're coming, to here, and suddenly in 73 with Yom Kippur War and the devastation there, sudden there was a lot, and there was Yerida after that.
Right. Absolutely. And we have that now too. We have people who've had too much, who feel the burden is too much, and they've left. We have waves of Aliyah, both because of anti-Semitism, especially in Europe, and because of the pride that October, after October, the last 2 years have done for us.
Crazy.
October 8th. Thank you. Right. Well, right. Those are the Jews who they talk about them as having a surge in their connection to Judaism and to Israel. But making Aliyah is a whole nother level. I agree. So I want to these are just some interesting historical pieces to share in light of Sefer Shemot because it's so relevant. In 2003, today we talk about the divide in Israeli society, and we have one. They also had big ones in the early 2000s, and famously, the previous president, Ruvi Rivlin, gave a speech about the 4 tribes in Israeli society. You can look it up. He talked about there being 4 tribes and how we really are lacking this national cohesion. If we're talking about, so if in the past what's united us as Zionists is the greatest act of unity was the anti-Semitism, or on October 7th, the attack from the outside. And so you saw, people pro-judicial reform and the biggest anti and the biggest pro, arm in arm in their unit in the army, and everything looks beautiful. Also, in the 2000s, there was this big question of division in Israeli society, and religion and state in Israel is at one of the big issues. Today, it's probably the biggest issue is Haredi conscription and this big issue of the Supreme Court and their power. And so interestingly, there was an attempt in 2003 by a secular academic, Ruth Gavison, and a rabbi from Yeshivat Har Etzion, thank you, Rav Matan, to offer something different, to offer a contract. They wanted to offer like what Rabbi Sachs talks about as like a social contract for the people, a covenant for a society. A society needs a national story that they share. And so here is an example of what they aspired for, which is already trying to give new meaning to we need Israel because we need to survive. Okay, so here's what they say. The Jews are one family, the offspring of our 3 patriarchs and 4 matriarchs, a single historical unit. The Jewish people delivered out of Egypt by the Almighty joined a mutual covenant with God on Mount Sinai. The Jewish people entered this covenant as a people and not as individuals, and the commandments we keep have a collective, not individual significance. This is the meaning of the mutual responsibility that connects all Jews, which refers not only to a shared struggle for existence and mutual aid, but also to the collective fulfillment of the commandments required to uphold the Sinai covenant. Mutual responsibility became even more powerful once a distinct association was established for the sake of a single purpose, a single ship, the state of Israel. The division between Jews, quote unquote, and Israelis, quote unquote, when juxtaposed against a large Arab population with a distinct national and religious identity, have no connection to the state of Israel, will weaken us and jeopardize our existence here. Okay, so here we saw this. This is exactly what we saw on October 7th, right? When we were at our most divisive, we were at our weakest. And so they are arguing, and perhaps it needs an update. And I don't think it had the success that they had dreamed of, but it needs an update of, all parts of Israeli society buying in some way to, and I actually would like to say that I think that also includes, we have a lot of unrest in the South with the Bedouins. We have the Druze who have joined our national covenant, but the Bedouins, there's still parts of Israeli society who are not Jewish as well, who could be a part of this.
It's interesting you saying that unfortunately it failed. It's also 2 years before the Hitnatkut.
Yes.
So before the expulsion of Gaza.
Disengagement, yeah. That was the year I made Aliyah. That summer, everyone had an orange ribbon on their car or a blue ribbon on their car.
Yeah. So that was
very divisive. Yeah, absolutely.
So it almost like totally negated anything that he was trying to do.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's true. We have not solved this, not cracked this code yet. Another Zionist thinker and international human rights lawyer who has defended Israel at the Criminal Court of Justice in The Hague, thank you, is Tal Becker. You may have heard him. He's been on a lot of podcasts recently. And he talks about something. We have secular Zionism, religious Zionism, all that stuff. He talks about aspirational Zionism. And I think this is a really beautiful term. And he says as follows: unlike political Zionism that underpins this crisis model, promoting a state that defines its Jewishness in minimalistic and largely, if not exclusively, survivalist terms, sorry, there's a typo here, and is a discussion about Israel founded on, what we need is a discussion about Israel founded on values, the unique opportunity and responsibility that comes with belonging to a people 3,500 years old. The question it seeks to address is not how do we survive, It is this: as custodians of an ancient story, as bearers of a particular moral tradition, and as people shaped by a particular historical experience, what form and nature should a Jewish sovereign society take? I mean the kind of Zionism that a values narrative engenders, one which imagines Israel not as a normal state, but as a state which gives public expression to the unique history and tradition of the Jewish people. When the people come to in the book of Shmuel, when the people come to Shmuel and say, "We want a king like Kachol Hagoyim, like all the other nations," right? The big criticism there is it's not that kingship is right in Israel. It's an ideal in Israel, at least in biblical times. But the way you do it is not by saying, I want a king like all the other nations. I want a king the Jewish way, right? Same thing with our country. We don't want a nation. We don't want a country that's just like all the other countries. We want something different. And I think really most of Israeli society reflects this. I think most people you meet, when you read the news, it looks different. But most people you meet on the street and encounter in Israeli society are a source of inspiration, carry this, whether they're religious or Masorati or secular. A lot of them carry this feeling of this is my people, and this is my story. And it still needs upgrading and improving. And at the same time, I think it's a really beautiful perspective on that.
Shimon Peres wanted Israel to be the new Hong Kong.
I think we can, the new Hong Kong. Shimon Peres talked about post-Zionism, right? And he really talked about Israel being
a new Hong Kong.
Right. Which was but it's a piece of who we are. That's interesting. If you look at everything with a good eye, right? He was right. Like, we are the startup nation. That's one of our major badges of honor. Right. He had a huge part in that. And so, and I don't know if anyone's been to the Perez Center in Tel Aviv. Yes. It's fascinating. But yes, it was a little bit not quite the right language. Not the language that's going to be lasting. I completely agree with you. One more source, and then we're turning to this week's source sheet, which is that actually, you know what? I'm just going to summarize this really quickly. There was something really fascinating that we noted in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, which is that there's this double language in the beginning of, on the one hand, the people of Israel the Egyptians said, Hava nitchak malo pen yirbe, right? Sorry, Paro says, let's be wise and enslave them because we don't want them to pen yirbe. We don't want them to increase. Well, how ironic. They're like increasing like bunny rabbits here, okay? And what happened? Right? We multiplied and we kept spreading. And so Rabbi Sachs just highlights that this is one of the secrets of Jewish survival and the Jewish people, which is not that we should ever want it to come upon us, the suffering, but one of the things which we've proven historically is that when we've been oppressed, persecuted historically, in the end, we've only had great success and creativity and the ability to overcome afterwards, right? Exactly, baby boons. And so this was the irony, is that it's almost like a history repeating itself model. Paro thought this was the way to quash us, but what he didn't understand, and what so many people who have persecuted us throughout history don't understand, is that this is our superpower as Jews, right? And Israelis. And you saw this in the last 2 years, right? What we were able to accomplish, and certainly it's led to a very different looking Middle East than the one before October 7th. So yeah, I think that's a very powerful point as well. Okay, so I really read Sefer Shemot at this point and here we're coming up to Parshat Shemot. This is our Parsha. It's literally like, it's talking to today. The relevance and resonance is really just strong. So now I want to explore a little more this question of identity and names. We've highlighted it a little bit, and some of you studied with me Megillat Esther a few years ago, and it's the same issue there. And in fact, Megillat Esther's playing with names and identity and what kind of names you have, actually, I believe, is drawing on this story when it does that, because it's also a story of diaspora, of Jews being persecuted, anti-Semitism, and Jews at the end being saved. And so I have a lot to say about that, but that's for an article one day. But here I want to get back to this question. On the one hand, we have the children of Israel going down to Egypt, listed by names, and the story is called "These Are Our Names." And at the same time, the chapter 1 is filled with anonymity and oppression. And yes, we're multiplying, but we have quantity, but do we have quality of identity? And so just before we get to what's happening, I want to show you the end of Breshit. The end of Breshit explains to us how we got here. Okay, so in chapter 47 of Breshit, we hear as follows. And this was the original intention of the Jews, of Yaakov's family going down to Egypt. This is not the first time that a patriarchal family goes down to Egypt. We've had Abraham and went down, and Yehuda goes at some point. And so here we hear as follows. ויאמרו על פרעה ויאמרו על פרעה לגור בארץ בנו, כי אין מרעה לצאן אשר לעבדיך, כי כבד הרב בארץ כנען, ועתה ישבו נא עבדיך בארץ גושן. So here say the brothers, we've come to, they say to Paro, we've come to this land because there's no, we can't, we're right, so thank you, shepherds. We are shepherds, and there's famine in Canaan, and we have no livelihood. We'll suffer. So we've come here, and we would like to stay in this area called Goshen. Okay, the first Jewish ghetto, as you know, we can call it. We'd like to live in Goshen. And then they say again, then we hear at the end, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim, be'eretz Goshen, vayachazuba, vayifru, vayirbu ma'od. So already this is happening in the end of Sefer Breshit, that that Yaakov and his family settles in, specifically in Goshen in Egypt, the city, and now what do we hear? Now they settle, but is it temporarily or is it permanently, right? What's the attitude here? What's the language here? That's a little bit confusing. Anyone who has been in Ra'anana knows Rehov Achuzah, okay, is the main street. Achuzah is a holding, right? Proper, right? So an acquiring of property. Vayechazuva, this language we're going to see, Nachama Leibowitz points out, is very strong language. They didn't just settle, they didn't just dwell for a time in the land of Goshen. Suddenly, already in Breshit, before we get to Shemot, Vayechazuva, they bought property. I'll tell you a personal story. When I first got married, I was living here. I made Aliyah by myself, and my husband was living, also we were living in Yerushalayim, and we met. And he said, I want to go get work experience in the States for 2 years, only 2 years, and then we're coming back. Of course, only 2 years becomes 7 years, the second intifada. We started to have children. One of my children had some minor medical issues. And so, okay, 2 years. Now we're living in Riverdale, and first in the city, then in Riverdale. And 7 years, we're coming up to 7 years, and we have 3 children, and we know we want to come back, but the second intifada is still kind of going strong, and it's a scary time to move back. And we had lived in Jerusalem, and it was a scary time to think about moving back with young children. And we knew we wanted to get here, but we didn't, it was feeling a little, now we always, my attitude was, we are renting our apartment. We even leased our car. I didn't want to le'echos. I didn't want to own things in America because that would keep me there longer. And so we started to outgrow our apartments, and we were like, okay, what do we do? So one day we started to look at houses. We went around to look at houses, and we went around and we came home, and we both looked at each other and said, okay, it's good we did that. Now we know this is not for us. We are not buying a house here. And so it was that exact point of Vayechazuba. Are you going to, right? Not to criticize. Of course, people have to do what they have to do. But the more you hold on to things,
similarly, when we made Aliyah from Boston, we had a house and the market was great. Well, that was all. Yeah. People
right.
said to us, why sell?
Yes.
You better
שניהם על
Times
Square, כזה.
Look, we weren't this couple that was waiting for years to make Aliyah.
Yes, yes.
We could stay in tomorrow.
Amazing.
But it was right, because we were able to decide.
That's right.
We had the money here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If it's right. Certainly, that's why I'm saying no judgment, everyone, financial and emotional and in their own time and in a good way. But for me, it was this real feeling when I learned this Nachama Leibowitz, I was like, oh, that was me, right? I didn't want to be a chosba. And they're continuing to increase. And so they're getting quite settled in the land of Egypt. Now, what happens? What happens? What is now? They don't have Torah yet, but they have Yaakov and they have his traditions, right? They have what they received from Yaakov. So how are they living? What kind of life are they living? Are they Jewish? Are they Israelite? Are they Hebrew? Are they Egyptian? What are they? And this is the question that the commentaries start to grapple with. And we're going to see two diametrically opposed views of this. And it's fascinating because you could argue that both are right. And it's also a really powerful point because, until October 8th, and still after, one of the biggest problems in Chutz La'aretz is Hitbolalut, assimilation, right? Rabbi Sachs wrote many things about assimilation of Jews and how so much of what he did was trying to reinvigorate Jewish life in London and in England and in the US. It's a major issue. If you're in Orthodox day schools and Orthodox institutions, for the most part, there's a really, really good chance that you will stay committed. But once you're outside, most Jews in America affiliate with non-Orthodox denominations. The chances of assimilation and marrying out go up and up and up and up. And I see it. I see it among communities. I see it among, family members. And it's a huge challenge. This is the challenge of diaspora life. We have different challenges in Israel life. Not to say we don't have challenges, but it's a challenge. And so we hear the Midrash, which talks about whether the Jews kept their Jewish identity in Egypt or didn't. Israel were redeemed from Egypt on account of four things, because they did not change their names, they did not change their language, they did not go talebearing, and none of them was found to have been immoral. Okay, they didn't act immorally. Meaning, they did not change their names, says the Midrash, having gone down as Reuven and Shimon, and they came up as well as Reuven and Shimon. This is such an ironic Midrash, and I'm going to tell you why soon. They did not call their son Reuven Rufus. By the way, the Midrash is being written in Greco-Roman times, right? So they're not saying, Pharaoh, they're saying Rufus. Nor did they call Yehuda Leon or Yosef Lestes or Binyamin Alexander, okay? By the way, sometimes these names, Alexander, right? My son is Yanai. Yanai was originally more of a Greek name, but it became a Jewish name. They did not change their language, as may be inferred from the fact that it is written elsewhere, and there came one that had escaped and told Avram the Hebrew. Okay, they're bringing proof text here. It doesn't matter. Okay, meaning they still dressed a certain way. They still had their Hebrew names. They still spoke Hebrew, and they didn't act immorally, right? These are the four things that. So what is it actually saying? Saying these are the keys. These are some of the keys to identity preservation. If you think about that to a certain degree, it makes a lot of sense in the modern world as well.
You never know what a sentence could say. When my husband was in grade school, I don't know when, the teacher went around the room and said, "What's your name? What's your name?" And they, Howard, and then all kinds of names, Frank, and who knows what. And there was one David. He said, and he laced it into them as if they really had a choice what their name is. But they said, he laced it. He says, where are the Hebrew names? I mean, of course they had a Hebrew name if they were in
Yes.
the shul. And he told me when we got married, when we have children, he only wants to give Hebrew names. This particular comment as a kid in grade school had such an influence on him. So this is
It's amazing how stories like that can have such an impact. Absolutely, absolutely. So here we have one Midrash saying now this Midrash conflicts with so much of what we know. I'm sure you've heard the famous idea that the Jews in Egypt reached the 49th level of impurity and that they were super disconnected. And we're going to see in a moment that it takes them a long time to call out to God. Like, where is God? There's no God in this story here. That's also another fascinating parallel to Esther. There's no explicit mention of God's name until the end of chapter 2. But Rav Ovadia Sforno, a medieval commentary, says as follows. He says something different. He says, Eila Shmot, the ones mentioned here were deserving to be mentioned with their names. The reason is that each one of them possessed sufficient individuality to give meaning to his name. Meaning, when at first Yaakov's children go down, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, we say their names because they still knew their names, okay? They were all of them an inspiration to their children, as not one of them abandoned his family tradition. However, after the death of that generation, even the relatively righteous ones among them did not rate so highly in the eyes of God or man, so that the Torah deemed it necessary to tell us their names. So he explains the way that the Sefer Shemot is such a big shift, names, 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 and then suddenly there's no names. And we're going to see in a moment a lot of anonymity. He explains that as a loss of identity, a lack of identity. I think that there's also something, this makes a lot of sense in the literal reading. On the other hand, the rabbis soon we'll see in a few weeks, we'll hear stories about the Nashim Tzidkaniot, the anonymous women of Egypt. Okay. And so if we have very righteous women who kept the Jewish people alive, why are they anonymous? Why are their names not mentioned? But we will see some women's names are mentioned, and the only names mentioned in the beginning of Shemot really are the names of women. So there's this real struggle in the sources. I'll read you Nechama Leibowitz about Ve'yechazuba, which is something that I mentioned already, has personal resonance for me. In source 4, she says, like all other calamities that have overtaken us, this exile too was a punishment for sin. Now, this is a biblical view. I wanted to say, taking her out of context, she's saying in the biblical world, when calamities occur to us, exile is the punishment. So maintain many of our rabbis. Sin in this context spelt the desire to assimilate. The children of Jacob, as was deliberately emphasized by them in their first encounter with Paro, entered Egypt merely to stay there temporarily. But as the text informs us, they not only stayed there, the Hebrew is lagur, right? At first it said they come lagur, to live temporarily, but they settled, yashuvu. What is more, Vayechazuba, they secured a permanent foothold. This was their sin, and for this they were punished. Their settlement and permanent foothold turned into exile and bondage. She quotes the Ha'emek Tavar commentary, but there are other midrashim which regard the sufferings or exile not as punishment, but as inspired by an educational purpose. The exile and suffering are for a refining and purificatory character, right? The idea we hear in Devarim, he brought you out of the iron furnace of Egypt to be his people, okay? Meaning this idea that we went through this so that we would be better people in the end, okay? But the Torah itself supplies a more specific reason for the exile, an educational one. Okay, so just to clarify, she is trying to explain what is the purpose of us going down to Egypt and being taken out from there as the beginnings of our peoplehood. And first, she brings the idea that we were punished. She seems to reject that. She then says that it was part of a purification of our character, a certain inui nefesh, a little bit of what we go through on Yom Kippur, like you have to withdraw from, you have to suffer a little to have some affliction to be purified, okay? And third, she says, is a totally different reason. And this is an educational one. But the Torah itself supplies a more specific reason for exile, an educational one, which draws on the experience of Egyptian exile and bondage as a motive for observing the commandments. Do not wrong a stranger, do not oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Just as the Egyptian exile prefigures every exile to which Israel was subjected, and just as Egyptian bondage provided the motivation and impulse for many moral imperatives, so did the redemption from Egypt serve as a spur for religious duty that imposed on every Jew to redeem his fellow being from the slavery he had been reduced to for lack of means. Okay, so her third reason is that it's not punishment, it's not affliction for refining of character, it's an educational experience, right? That you have to go through a certain amount of hardship, okay, to be able to truly have empathy, okay? I went to a talk this week about I heard someone talk about the difference between sympathy and empathy, right? And that sympathy she actually showed a very cute video by Brené Brown. It's like a cartoon. And the character who was trying to be sympathetic kept saying to the person who was under a cloud and crying, the person kept saying, you look sad. Do you want a sandwich? Your dog died. At least you still have your house, right? Like things that are sympathy, but not empathy. Okay. She was trying to show the difference. And she said, empathy is when you're able to just be under the cloud with the person for a time, right? And I think that that's really what this third reason of Nechama Leibowitz is, that we are able to really be in that place of under that cloud with, right? We're able to, our heart goes out in a way to people who suffer because we've been through
I
that.
want to share something interesting.
Yes.
My son was just taken from birthright.
Amazing.
He says, it says, I was this group. Since October 7th, basically any birthright groups that come bring him from his experience is that you have more empathy, that you have educationally, wherever these students are coming, well, they're not all students, they're young professionals, whatever they're coming from, something, there's been a shift, he says, that even what they take them to in Israel has had to change. But he said that he doesn't find it so challenging in the way he did beforehand. Because beforehand, there was a lot of, negative feelings towards, even if they were coming here on a free trip to Israel, he finds that he doesn't have to push that. Something shifted in the younger population that are coming.
Wow.
That have a certain more empathy and understanding of what they're struggling with.
Yes.
And
You think the other ones aren't coming?
Right. I think that there's two
that
types.
could be, it could be that.
There's two types of October 8th Jews, right? There's the ones who, the October 8th Jews, what we call, which are the ones that had that surge, that feeling, and they're coming, and the ones who voted for Mamdani, unfortunately. Yes. I agree with you. But yes, it's so, and this is our forever our challenge. And by the way, I think that some of the ones who feel distant from Israel, they still have in their DNA. They're getting mixed up, right? If we want to look at them with a good eye, which is not so easy, the idea is that they've been taught their whole lives to look out for the oppressed, right? And this is very much the narrative of Israel as the oppressor, and and the Palestinians are the oppressed, and there may even be historically some truth to that. At the same time, you need to have the ability to look into things and understand things and truly learn the truth and see that that's not the paradigm for this moment. So absolutely. But they still have that. They still have that lesson ingrained within them that Nachama Leibowitz is talking about. So let's now read inside. We usually start with our sources here. We're ending with our source, and that's okay. We'll set ourselves up for next time. So after chapter 1, which we read last week, and the people become enslaved, we hear this curious story. And I just want to remind you that chapter 1 ended with Paro trying to kill all the boys, and the midwives say, oh, by the time we get to the birth, the boys are already born, the women give birth so quickly. And we're going to talk about the midwives in a few weeks. And by the way, this is the only mention of the word God in chapter 1. It says, Vatirena hameildot et haElokim. They fear God, so they don't listen to Paro. And then he says to them, he just has this rule now. Okay, once the babies are born, all boys have to be thrown into the Nile. So now, in light of this background, we hear the following story about an individual family in Egypt, an Israelite family. Chapter 2, verse 1, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, this is source 5, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, veikach et bat Levi. Vatar haisha v'telet ben, v'tera oto ki tov hu v'titzvaneu shlosha yerachim. Okay, so in light of the fact that we just had this whole interaction about how you should not, people who have Jewish children, their boys will be thrown into the Nile. Interesting that we're hearing about a very, again, total anonymity here, a man from the house of Levi who takes a daughter of Levi, and she gets pregnant, and they have a child, and they seek Hitovu, okay? And they hide him for 3 months. Pasuk Gimel, v'lo yachla od hitzpino, v'tikach lo tevat gome, v'tachmara, b'chemar, v'zefet, v'tasem bat hayeled, v'tasem basuf al sfat hayor. Well, 3 months come along. She's not able to hide him anymore. We're going to see what the Midrashim say about why she was able to hide him for 3 months. And then he's going to be taken. So she herself, in an attempt to save him, puts him in a basket on the Nile, and he's protected. So let's see what happens. Verse 4, and his sister stands on the side and waits to see what's going to happen to him. Verse Hey, Vatered bat paro lirchotz al hayaor, v'narotea holchotz al yad hayaor, vateret hateva betoch hasuf, v'tishlachet amata, v'tikachea. Irony of ironies, who comes down to the Nile? The daughter of Pharaoh, and she and her ladies in waiting are, bathing and hanging out, and they see this teva, this little basket come along the Nile, and she reaches out her arm and takes it. Verse 6, Vatiftach v'tireu et hayeled, v'hina nar boche, v'tachmol alav, v'tomer miyaldei ha'ikuzeh. Okay, so she opens it up and sees this boy crying, and she has mercy on him and says, oh, he's from the Hebrews. Okay. Zayin, v'tomer achoto el bat paro, ha'elech v'karati lach isha mineket mina ivriot v'tinik lach et hayeled. Why don't I, now Miriam steps in, Moshe's sister, and says, why don't I take him to be nursed by a Hebrew midwife, by a Hebrew woman, Hebrew nursemaid. Verse chet, v'tomer la bat paro, lechi v'telech ha'alma v'tikra et em hayeled. So Miriam, Moshe's sister, goes to Yocheved, his mother, and she gets to nurse him. Verse 10, v'tomer la bat paro, helechi et hayeled hazeh v'henikehu li, v'ani atem et tzarech v'tikach ha'isha hayeled v'tinikehu. They make an arrangement. Moshe's mother gets to breastfeed him, and all is well. And then verse 10, v'yidal hayeled v'taviehu levat paro, v'hila leven v'tikra shmo Moshe. V'tomer ki min hamayim mishitihu. Verse 10, the boy grows up and he is brought to Bat Paro. She adopts him as a son and she names him. She names him Moshe, explaining, I drew him out of the water. Okay, so ki min hamayim meshitihu, Moshe meshitihu. Okay, so let's do a little analysis and then we'll break. What do you notice here? What do you see
No
as
one's given a name.
excellent?
No one except Moshe.
Exactly.
And his name is given by Pharaoh's daughter.
Paro. There's exactly so much when we think about the names. It's so rich from a literary perspective here. It's really incredible. Look who's it. Bat Levi. That's Yocheved. Amram, Moshe's father. They get names. Like we can hear their names later on in Torah. It's not that they remain anonymous, but at this point they have no name. A random man, a random woman, okay? And they have this baby who doesn't get named for quite a long time. And we have Bat Paro, the daughter of Pharaoh. She also has a name later on, we hear in Tanakh. Miriam's doesn't have a name here. Miriam's going to be a very significant character in the story, but here she's just Achoto. The literary use of the using of the lack of names, the anonymity, is so strong here. It's so strong. Very powerful. It really gives us this feeling of notice this, right? Notice this. And so when you read this chapter next to the last chapter, the beginning of Shemot is very much evoking this question: do you have a name? And if so, what is your name? And also, sometimes some of these anonymous characters are coming in, we're watching them come into their names, come into who they're going to be. Anything else you noticed about this?
This is not a Hebrew name.
Amazing. Thank you. Rachel's pointing out that Moshe is not a Hebrew name. The truth is, we're going to see next week, that's actually a source of debate in the commentary. Some say it is a Hebrew name and some say it isn't a Hebrew name. But let's go for a moment with the argument that it's not a Hebrew name, which is what probably most academic scholars would say today. Well, whoa, hang on. Moshe, the leader of the Jewish people, now we know that he's going to have a very confused identity. He's not going to have a Hebrew name. How can that be? What do we do with that? And that's a really excellent point. Thank you. Anything else surprise you, find interesting in this? Let's talk about Bat Paro for a moment.
Yeah, well, listen, she's going against her father's decree.
Yeah, it's astonishing, right? Here is the daughter of Pharaoh, and she knows he's from the Ephraim, okay, and she takes him anyway. And so there's something very, they're saying now that in Iran, they're saying that we've been here before. These protests, there's a real moment of crisis and weakness, and that the government could topple easily, but they need to start to see different forces within the government, different voices, different tension with the Ayatollah. And you feel that here. You feel that, you have this dictator, Paro, but where's the weakness? Where's the thing that's going to start to topple his rule? Where does it begin? Within his own family, within his own world. And I think that that's really something very, very noticeable about
I
Paro.
think in this particular paragraph, it's the action is more important than the actual identification of the person.
Ooh.
It's a lot of action. I mean, she was standing on the side. She took out her arm and if I can play it as a pantomime, I can see that there's action here. And maybe at this point, the people aren't first place. That.
That is an incredible point, and I think that's really beautiful. Sometimes sometimes the story is more important. First of all, it also highlights that this story is a story that's it's not only a story for this moment in Moshe's life, it's a story of the Jewish people again and again. And throughout history, we're always going to have these brave people. Many of them we don't know their names, right? We don't know the brave people. We don't know all their names from the time of the Crusades or the time of the destruction of the Second Temple or the today we're finally in a world where we, but even holding on, even after October 7th, holding on to all the names at first when there were over 200 hostages and over 1,200 people killed, right? How do you remember? How do you keep track? How do you hold each name and give it what it deserves? And I think the story is also saying, well, sometimes it's not only, we do want to know the names, but we also see that that it's conveying to us what bravery looks like. And yes.
I just wanted to say, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but it talks about Moshe as being a Yeled and a Nar.
Yes. Right, beautiful. So
Relationships.
yes, there's almost I love that. It follows very well from what Irene said, is that it's very much an emphasis on the relationships between the people, right? She's to Bat Paro, she's a young maiden to Moshe, she's his sister, she's his protector. And that's I think that's very powerful. I also want to point out that, and we'll close with this, this story is all about women, right? It's like astonishing. From the moment that Paro tells the midwives to kill the baby boys, we see the heroism of women, and it's astonishing.
We're going
to learn that midrash.
Yeah.
Yes,
that we were liberated from Egypt.
Absolutely, and that midrash is 100% based on this. That it's all the women. It's all the women doing things. And again, this is also something that we've seen throughout history. Women often are not named. We often don't know. There are many women in history who we don't have their names. Very few women we have named. But we know that there were many women throughout history who were heroic and did amazing things and kept families together. That's the best way to close today. Yes, please. Thank you. And I'm sorry about that.
No.
Lots to talk about.